I'm still trying to process everything I just watched because part 2 didn't just feel like another episode of a documentary. It felt like a slow, suffocating unraveling of an entire era, an era built on talent, greed, fear, and unspeakable loss. And the deeper it went, the more uncomfortable it became to accept how normalized manipulation and exploitation were at the very highest level of this industry. Because by the end of it all, I wasn't just watching a story about music anymore. I was watching a story about power, control, silent threats, and human lives reduced to chess pieces. And at the center of all of it, whether people like it or not, the documentary repeatedly circles back to one figure, Sean Diddy Combs. And what's unsettling is not just what is being alleged, but how convincingly everything is being connected. How one decision leads into another, how one rivalry turns into a war, how one death becomes the foundation of someone else's empire. And the further this narrative unfolds, the harder it becomes to separate coincidence from calculation, because when you really sit with it, too many things line up in ways that don't feel random anymore. What hurts the most is realizing that at the heart of this entire storm were two artists whose only real crime was being greater than the systems around them, the notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur, two young men whose voices shaped a generation, whose music carried stories of struggle, ambition, pain, and survival, and yet both of them ended up swallowed by forces far bigger than themselves, forces that thrived on conflict and bloodshed. And when the documentary revisits Biggie's final days, what shook me was how ordinary his intentions were compared to how catastrophic the outcome became, because all he wanted to do was leave Los Angeles the next morning, get on a plane to London, fulfill his media obligations, continue building his career, and go back to focusing on his family and his craft. That was the plan that had been set in motion for weeks. A clean exit, a reset, a future that was still wide open. But that future was quietly wiped out by a decision that on the surface looked harmless, a decision to stay, to party, to be seen, to flex presence in a city that was already boiling with tension. And when that decision is placed next to everything else that was happening behind the scenes, the documentary suggests that this was never just about celebrating, it was about dominance, about control, about sending a message. And in that moment when Biggie was sitting in that car, unaware that his life was literally about to end in seconds, the tragedy becomes unbearable to even imagine. As the episode moves forward, the layers begin to stack, and that's where the role of those so-called unseen players becomes impossible to ignore, especially when the documentary introduces the newly surfaced recordings tied to Keef D. Because hearing someone speak so openly about the inner workings of what allegedly led to Tupac's death is chilling in a way that scripted television could never replicate. And even with all the later backtracking and attempts to discredit those statements, words like that are spoken into the public space, they don't just disappear, they linger, they echo, and they force people to re-examine decades of official narratives. And what makes those recordings so disturbing is not just what is said, but what is implied, the suggestion that waves were made intentionally, that confrontations were manipulated, that violence was not only expected but exploited, and that while some men pulled the triggers, others allegedly moved the entire board from a safe distance. And that's where fear starts to become a constant presence in this story, because even now, decades later, the documentary makes it clear that many people are still terrified to speak openly, not because of what happened in the past, but because of what they believe still has the power to follow them today, and that alone should make any viewer pause, because fear that survives for this long is not the kind of fear that comes from rumors, it is the kind of fear that comes from experience, and it becomes even more unsettling when those insiders begin to speak, especially when Kirk Burroughs steps into the narrative, because the way he recounts these events does not feel theatrical, it feels painful, restrained, like someone who carried the weight of this truth for years and is only now allowing himself to finally breathe through it. And as he speaks about contracts, money, control, and betrayal, you begin to realize that the violence didn't only happen on the streets, it also happened in boardrooms, in offices, in whispered conversations where careers were quietly ended and loyalty was quietly sold to the highest bidder. The documentary then pulls you directly into the chaos of the East Coast versus West Coast war, a war that was fueled not just by lyrical jabs, but by real blood, real gang affiliations, and real grudges that went far beyond the music itself. And at the center of that storm were names that became symbols of power and fear, including Suge Knight, whose shadow loomed over every confrontation, whose presence alone was enough to escalate any situation from business into warfare, and watching how Tupac became entangled in this volatile environment is one of the most heartbreaking parts of the entire episode, because the documentary does not paint him as a man seeking constant violence, but rather as a man who felt increasingly trapped inside a machine that demanded he play a role he could not easily step away from. And as tensions grew, as alliances shifted, as loyalty became currency, the space for peace shrank with every passing moment. What truly devastates me is how clearly the episode suggests that Biggie himself did not even want to be part of this war, that he was focused on his music, his success, his ability to elevate not only himself but those around him, yet his image, his name, his very existence became a pawn in someone else's game, and once his life was taken, what followed feels like one of the coldest transformations of grief into profit in modern music history, because instead of silence, instead of retreat, instead of reflection, the public saw releases, magazine covers, appearances, tributes that conveniently aligned with chart performance and commercial dominance, and that contrast between loss and marketing is what makes so many people angry even today, because it feels like the line between mourning and monetization was erased without hesitation. As insiders like Mark Curry begin to describe their experiences, the environment that emerges is not one of brotherhood and shared success, but of constant fear, paranoia, and survival, where deals changed overnight, where questioning authority meant exile, and where silence was not just encouraged, it was enforced. And the deeper the documentary goes, the more it becomes clear that the public image of celebration and luxury was masking an ecosystem built on intimidation and psychological pressure. And that realization forces the viewer to reconsider every old clip, every old interview, every carefully crafted narrative that once seemed harmless. One of the most disturbing aspects of Part 2 is how it shows the obsession with image persist even as everything begins to crumble, because even in footage from much later years, as legal pressure mounts and the walls begin to close, and the focus remains on appearance, on jewelry, on presence, on control over how the world sees him. And this fixation is presented not as vanity alone, but as a survival mechanism, a way of maintaining dominance even when power is slipping away. And that obsession ties directly into what the documentary frames as a complete lack of empathy, because empathy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is the one thing this system never tolerated. What makes all of this even more unsettling is the way the documentary recontextualizes old interviews, especially those moments where Diddy portrayed himself as isolated, misunderstood, alone, a man without many friends, because when those clips are placed beside the testimonies of insiders who describe control, fear, and exploitation, the performance becomes impossible to ignore. It starts to feel rehearsed, calculated, like another mask worn to manipulate public perception. And when you realize how frequently that mask was rewarded with sympathy, success, and credibility, it becomes deeply troubling to reflect on how easily image can override truth in the public consciousness. Part 2 does not limit its focus to physical violence alone. It exposes a much wider system of erasure, contracts altered under pressure, credit quietly reassigned, power stripped from those who resisted, and careers dismantled without explanation. And this is where the emotional weight of the episode truly sets in, because it becomes clear that survival within this world often depended less on talent and more on obedience. And those who refused to fall in line paid a price that extended far beyond finances. The legal backdrop surrounding these revelations only intensifies the impact of everything being shown, because the story is no longer confined to the past. It is bleeding directly into the present, with impending trials, appeals, and renewed public scrutiny forcing old wounds back into the open. And when law enforcement officials are shown describing Diddy as uncooperative and difficult to work with in the aftermath of Biggie's murder, that detail alone introduces a chilling contradiction. Because grief usually disarms people, but power often does the opposite. And that contrast raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Even the brief reappearance of Jennifer Lopez during this era serves as a haunting reminder of how closely fame, glamour, danger, and criminal suspicion were entangled, with public figures moving through clubs, parties, and public events while unseen threats followed behind the scenes, and it reinforces the idea that this was not an isolated underworld. This was the very heart of mainstream celebrity culture at the time. By the time the episode reaches its final moments, what lingers is not just outrage but exhaustion, the kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from realizing how many people were swallowed by this system while only a few reaped the rewards, because Biggie is gone, Tupac is gone, Suge is imprisoned, and yet for many years, the man at the center of all these conflicts continued to rise, continued to dominate, continued to reshape the industry in his image, and it forces you to confront the uncomfortable truth that success does not always belong to the most deserving. It often belongs to the most ruthless. And as I sat there watching the credits roll, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story is far from finished, that what we are witnessing now is not closure, but the slow peeling back of decades of silence, fear, and buried testimony, and whether every allegation is ultimately proven in court or not. What cannot be denied is that Part 2 has fundamentally altered the way these events can be viewed, because once manipulation is recognized as the central thread connecting all of this, it becomes impossible to unsee how deeply it shaped everything that followed. And that realization alone is enough to make this episode one of the most unsettling pieces of hip-hop storytelling ever put on screen. What struck me the most as Part 2 continued to unfold was how the documentary stopped feeling like a timeline of isolated events and started to feel like a slow exposure of a system that had been rotting from the inside for years, because once the focus shifted more deeply toward Tupac Shakur, the story stopped being abstract and became painfully human. And what's terrifying is how clearly the episode shows that his final months were defined by constant surveillance, paranoia, manipulation, and the pressure of being surrounded by people who were not always operating in his best interest. Because at this stage of his life, Tupac was not just an artist anymore, he was a symbol, a weapon, a bargaining chip, and a target all at the same time. And that combination is exactly what placed him directly in the line of fire. The documentary walks you through how his move into the orbit of Death Row Records completely altered the trajectory of his life. How the alliance with Suge Knight brought both protection and danger. How the promise of freedom, resources, and power came bundled with expectations of retaliation, loyalty, and war. And that balance between security and destruction becomes the central tension of Tupac's final stretch. Because while he was creating some of the most influential and emotionally charged music of his career, he was also being pulled deeper into an environment where violence was not just present, it was normalized, rewarded, and at times encouraged as a tool of business. One of the most unsettling sequences in this part is the way the documentary revisits the events leading up to that infamous confrontation in Las Vegas, because the way it is framed makes it clear that this was not simply an impulsive act of street justice. It is presented as a spark that had been carefully waited for, as a moment that others believed could be exploited once Tupac reacted the way they anticipated he would. And when the details of that night are laid out piece by piece, from the boxing match to the casino hallway to the sudden eruption of violence, it becomes impossible to see it as just another fight. It feels like the final move in a series of calculated steps that had been set into motion long before the first punch was ever thrown. Then come the allegations connected to Keefe D., and this is where the narrative takes on an even darker tone, because the documentary doesn't just present rumors or secondhand stories, it presents recorded statements, accounts of meetings, descriptions of vehicles, weapons, and orders. And even though legal guilt is something only a court can ultimately decide, the emotional impact of hearing someone describe a murder with such casual specificity is devastating, and what shakes viewers the most is not just the content of those recordings, but the implication that Tupac's death was not the result of random street violence, but the end of a chain of events driven by revenge, ego, money, and power. As the story navigates through this landscape, what becomes increasingly clear is how deeply interconnected all of these figures were, how the same names kept resurfacing in different cities, different confrontations, and different negotiations, and how difficult it becomes to believe that such a tightly wound network of conflicts could exist without certain individuals understanding exactly how volatile the situation had become, because when you step back and look at it as a whole, it doesn't resemble chaos, it resembles a war with structure, leadership, and strategy. What makes Tupac's death even more tragic is the way the documentary emphasizes how conflicted he was in those final weeks. A man torn between rage and reflection, between wanting to confront his enemies and wanting to escape the very environment that kept pulling him back into confrontation. And when you watch his last interviews again through this lens, you can see the exhaustion in his eyes, you can hear the strain in his voice, you can feel the pressure of a young man who had been forced to grow up in the middle of a battlefield he did not fully create, yet was expected to lead. And then, almost without giving you time to breathe, the documentary draws a haunting parallel between Tupac's fate and that of the notorious B.I.G., showing how the same web of rivalry, provocation, and silent power struggles that claimed one life remained active and unresolved when the other was taken months later. And it is in this overlap that the story becomes unbearable to ignore. because it suggests that these were not two unconnected tragedies, but two acts within the same dark play, carried out by different hands, but driven by overlapping motives. As the narrative circles back toward the East Coast, the tension feels heavier, more suffocating, because by this point the industry is holding its breath, journalists are speculating, fans are choosing sides, and the public face of hip-hop is becoming inseparable from the image of violence. And behind all of that noise, the documentary suggests that quiet negotiations, silent warnings, and coded messages were continuing to move between cities, shaping outcomes in ways that the outside world could not yet fully see. When Biggie returns to Los Angeles during this volatile moment, the sense of dread is almost unbearable, because the viewer already knows how it will end. Yet watching the final steps unfold feels like watching someone walk into a trap they were never meant to survive. And the documentary emphasizes over and over again that Biggie himself had no real interest in escalating any feud, that he was focused on business, family, and global success, yet his very presence in a city consumed by unresolved bloodshed placed him directly in harm's way, whether he intended it or not. What is most disturbing is how the episode portrays the immediate aftermath of Biggie's death, not through grief alone, but through the rapid shift back into industry machinery, because while fans and families were still in shock, the systems of profit, publicity, and power resumed their rotation almost instantly. And this is where the allegations against Sean Diddy Combs become especially chilling, because the narrative presented is not simply that he survived this devastation, but that he emerged from it stronger, more visible, and more commercially dominant than ever. And that contrast between public mourning and private advancement is what leaves such a bitter taste in the viewer's mouth. The documentary does not shy away from depicting how Biggie's legacy was shaped and reshaped in the months following his death, how album releases, promotional appearances, and media narratives converged into a tidal wave of attention that lifted some while doing nothing to bring justice to others. And when you see charts climbing, awards being presented, and interviews celebrating success, while two families were left without their sons, the imbalance feels almost cruel in its bluntness. What's even more unsettling is how insiders describe the atmosphere during this period. An atmosphere where people did not feel safe to question anything, where speaking openly about doubts or suspicions could cost you your career or worse. And this is where the theme of fear resurfaces with even greater weight, because fear was not only directed at external enemies, it was cultivated internally as a tool of control. And the documentary makes it clear that many who remained silent did so not because they supported what was happening, but because they were terrified of what might happen if they didn't. As the episode progresses, the tone shifts from shock to quiet rage, a slow realization that for years the public consumed a version of history that was carefully curated, sanitized, and packaged in ways that protected certain figures while leaving the most painful questions unanswered. And what is so difficult to reconcile is how effectively that version of history was accepted, repeated, and normalized across generations of media. One of the most powerful moments in this part of the documentary is when former associates speak about the psychological toll of living in that environment, of constantly looking over their shoulders, of weighing every word they said in public, of knowing that associations alone could place them in danger. And when those people describe the long-term trauma that followed them long after the spotlight faded, it becomes clear that the damage did not end with the deaths themselves. It rippled outward for decades, quietly reshaping lives that never made headlines. What lingers heavily is the idea that both Tupac and Biggie were ultimately consumed by conflicts that had outgrown music entirely, that had evolved into battles over territory, narrative control, revenge, and image. And in that transformation, the artistry that originally connected millions of fans across the world was reduced to background noise in a war driven by far darker motives. As Part 2 moves closer toward its end, it becomes increasingly clear that this is not a story that can be wrapped up neatly, because every answer uncovered seems to expose several new questions, and every testimony seems to point toward a deeper layer of complexity, where legal truth, personal belief, and public myth collide in ways that are almost impossible to separate completely. What the documentary succeeds in doing, perhaps more than anything else, is forcing viewers to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge for simple heroes and villains, and to confront the possibility that the systems we often celebrate for creating stars may also be the same systems that destroy them, quietly and without accountability for years. And as the final minutes of this episode fade out, what you are left with is not closure, but a heavy sense of unfinished business, the awareness that two of the most influential voices in hip-hop history were silenced under circumstances that still feel unresolved, and that the truth, whatever form it eventually takes, has been delayed by layers of fear, power, and carefully constructed public narratives. This part doesn't just revisit Tupac and Biggie as legendary names, it reintroduces them as human beings who lived, dreamed, struggled, and ultimately died in an environment that fed on conflict. And in doing so, it pushes the viewer toward a realization that feels deeply uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. That their deaths were not just tragic endings, they were also warnings about what happens when art, ego, violence, and unchecked power are allowed to merge without restraint. By the time the screen goes dark, one truth is impossible to escape: that this story is not finished, that the legal system has not yet delivered the kind of answers that history demands, and that the silence surrounding these events, though cracked, has not yet fully shattered. And with that realization, the weight of what is still to come hangs heavy in the air, setting the stage for what the final part of this documentary promises to confront. By the time the final part begins, it becomes painfully clear that this story is no longer just about the past. It is about everything that followed, every year of silence, every unanswered question, every career that was built higher while two graves remained cold and unresolved. And what hits hardest is realizing how easily time can dull outrage when power and money keep moving forward. Because while the world moved on to new trends and new stars, the families of the notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur were left frozen in the same moment of loss, year after year, forced to watch the industry that once celebrated their sons continue to thrive without ever delivering the justice that was promised. And the documentary slowly shifts its focus into this exact reality: the long aftermath, the legal dead ends, the closed doors, the intimidation, and the pattern of stories being buried rather than resolved. What becomes even more disturbing is how the episode highlights the repeated attempts by some detectives and investigators to reopen these cases, only to be stalled by jurisdictional issues, missing evidence, uncooperative witnesses, and a cloud of fear that refused to lift. And when former law enforcement officials speak about how difficult it was to even question certain powerful figures, you begin to understand that this was never just a street-level problem. This was a system-level problem, where influence extended into places that were supposed to exist purely for justice. And that realization is quietly horrifying, because it suggests that the truth may not have been lost, it may have been deliberately boxed in and left to suffocate. As the documentary moves through the years that followed, it becomes impossible to ignore how one figure continued to rise through nearly every storm: Sean Diddy Combs. And what makes that rise so unsettling is the contrast between the devastation that surrounded his world and the unstoppable momentum of his success. Because no matter how loud the whispers became, no matter how many questions lingered in the background, the public image remained polished, powerful, and protected. And the documentary does something chilling here. It plays old interviews back to back with new revelations, allowing the viewer to see just how carefully every word, every emotion, every pause was managed for public consumption. And once you see that technique exposed, it becomes impossible to unsee it. One of the most emotionally exhausting segments of this final part is when the families are brought back into focus, because up until now the story has moved through power, money, and industry politics, but when the mothers, the children, and the siblings of the victims speak, the noise fades and all that remains is grief, raw, unresolved, and permanent. And suddenly the conversation returns to what was always at its core. Two young men who never got the chance to grow old, never got to see their children grow up, never got to watch the full impact of their art unfold, and that human loss cuts through every theory and every accusation with unbearable clarity. As the documentary examines the legal roadblocks that followed, the lawsuits, the sealed files, the claimed evidence that vanished, the witnesses who suddenly changed their stories, you begin to see a repeated pattern where momentum toward truth would start to build and then abruptly collapse. And this is where the audience begins to feel the crushing weight of institutional exhaustion. The realization that even when truth fights to surface, it can be pushed back down again by layers of influence that the average person never gets to see. And that alone raises a terrifying question about how many other truths throughout history have met the same fate. The final part also revisits the fear surrounding those who once worked closely inside the system. People who have remained silent for decades not because they lacked information, but because they believed speaking out would place a target on their backs. And when those now older voices finally begin to surface, you can hear the shaking in their speech, not from age, but from memories they carried in isolation for years. And their testimonies don't sound rehearsed or dramatic, they sound like quiet confessions that were never meant to be spoken aloud. And that understated honesty makes their stories far more unsettling than any loud accusation ever could. At this point in the narrative, the theme of manipulation becomes unavoidable. Not just manipulation of individuals, but manipulation of history itself, because as careers were built, markets expanded, and legends were monetized, the real stories beneath them were carefully edited out of the mainstream record, replaced with cleaner, safer versions that preserved the brand while burying the bloodstains. And the documentary forces you to confront just how willingly the public accepted those narratives for years simply because the music was good and the platform was powerful. What makes this realization so painful is that many of the people who benefited from that system were not necessarily the ones who created the violence, but they were the ones who chose comfort over truth, silence over accountability, because challenging the structure would have meant risking everything. And in that sense, the documentary doesn't just accuse individuals. It quietly indicts an entire culture that rewarded success without demanding moral responsibility. As modern footage is introduced, showing arrests, investigations, and renewed scrutiny, the energy of the story shifts again, this time from historical tragedy to present-day reckoning, and what once felt untouchable suddenly looks fragile. Because for the first time in decades, the power that once seemed immune to consequence is being publicly challenged, and you can feel the tension rise as journalists, commentators, and former insiders all begin to speak with a freedom they never believed they would have, and this shift in atmosphere alone signals that something fundamental has changed. What is deeply unsettling, however, is the realization that this reckoning arrived far too late for the two men whose names sit at the center of everything, because no trial, no verdict, and no confession can ever return what was taken from Tupac and Biggie, and the documentary never lets the viewer forget that truth. It repeatedly pulls you back from strategy and spectacle, and reminds you that behind every headline were mothers who never slept peacefully again and children who grew up without their fathers. The final moments of the episode return to the question that has haunted this entire story from the beginning. How did so many people get away with so much for so long? And the answer that emerges is not a single villain or a single conspiracy, but a web, a network of fear, money, loyalty, corruption, and myth-making that together formed a shield so thick it took decades for even the first cracks to appear. And when that realization finally sinks in, it becomes clear that this was never just about two murders, it was about how power protects itself. As the documentary closes, what lingers is not certainty, but an unbearable mix of anger and grief, because the audience is left to wrestle with the possibility that the full truth may never be known in a courtroom, that justice, if it comes at all, may arrive only in fragments through testimony, memory, and public reckoning rather than formal verdicts. And that unresolved conclusion is perhaps the most unsettling part of all, because it mirrors real life far more often than we want to admit. The story ends not with triumph, but with a warning, a reminder that when artists become commodities and conflict becomes currency, human life is often treated as collateral, and the cost of that system is paid not only in blood, but in generations of silence, trauma, and unanswered questions. And as the final frames fade, one truth stands above all others, that Tupac and Biggie were not just victims of violence. They were victims of a machine that consumed talent, exploited conflict, and climbed higher as bodies fell. And whether the full truth ever reaches a courtroom or not, history is already beginning to re-examine what it once accepted without resistance. And as I sat there after the final episode ended, I realized that this documentary does not give you comfort. It gives you responsibility, the responsibility to question narratives, to challenge power, and to remember that behind every myth is a human being whose life mattered far more than any chart position or business empire ever could, and that, more than anything else, is the haunting legacy this story leaves behind.